Thanks everybody for being here. So I'm sorry Noah couldn't be here. He's a graduate student that worked on this. He's moved on to a totally unrelated job in transit, and so I'm going to present it in his stead. I want to start out by recognizing MAUS, the character from post-World War II graphic novels resisting the fascist regime of the time. I felt like it was a good character for today. And want to acknowledge the Wildlife Conservation Network and the Pacific Southwest Region UTC for support of the work that I'm going to talk about. Also acknowledging a lot of different states, both DOTs and Fish and Wildlife people, and specific data contributions from individual states that are listed, as well as Conservation Northwest, Peninsula Open Space Trust, Santa Clara Valley Habitat Agency, and Wildlands Network. And then also student assistance from the students listed there. The objectives was basically were to go beyond what are primarily expert opinions about what wildlife prefer and actually use data to decide or to determine what is likely that they're preferring or tolerating in terms of structures, and use those potentially to inform wildlife crossing design. This part of the objective is how we actually did it, which is to develop predictive statistical models. And I say preferences, I would say tolerance is probably a better word for this. Individual species for structural attributes and also locational and also climatic changes or differences. And then another way to frame this is to say, given a certain design, what species are likely to come or use it? So one is from the animal perspective, where do I want to go? And the other is from the structure perspective, what animals might use the structure. And then the third is also predicting frequency of use, where you have frequency of use information. And then these coefficients and the variables can be used to, are being used in an open web tool that'll be talked about on Thursday. So the data inputs came throughout the country, thanks to the partners in those states. A lot of them were from California, but they were distributed throughout the states shown here. There were 1,164 camera locations, 562 were from structures, and 602 from background, meaning non-structure locations. These were across a really wide range of land use types. This is the National Land Cover data set in the background. The legend for those is on the far right. And so we had lots of different attributes, biogeographic attributes, as well as structural attributes to use in the modeling. The camera trap data came from the list of states in the top there, and we had 27 species or species groups. And species groups, I think, is a weakness in camera trapping, because people don't always specify what kind of squirrel it was. We do at the Road Ecology Center. I think everybody should do that. That's one part of it. Another part of it is a little more forgiving and diplomatic. It's not always possible to identify the species exactly, but you can tell it's a chipmunk or a squirrel or something like that. We had 36,000 odd independent observations, and we counted the animals if they entered or exited a structure, which is not as conservative as if we had cameras on both sides or both ends and confirmed a crossing event. And the reason for that is that very few people do that. So we wouldn't have enough data to do this. The variables we used did not include Julia Kinch, but did include things about the structures that she's standing in, culverts and bridges, height, length, width, calculated openness ratio, different time of day, seasonality variables, and a variety of different land cover or geographic variables. We used the square. We also used the square of the dimensional attributes and the square root of the land cover attributes. The reason we use the square root of the land cover attributes is that if you think of a structure in the middle of a circle, its opportunity for encountering the structure does not vary linearly with the available landscape around it. It varies with the square of the land around it. So we use the square root of the land variables around the structure. Two kinds of modeling took place. A lot of this is things, these are things I didn't do, the student did it, but I'm gonna pretend I'm gonna say we. So we did forward and backward stepwise regression, which is basically adding variables and removing variables. We estimated coefficients and standard deviations for these different species variable combinations and used these to find models that significantly explain the structure use for different species and species groups. So as I said at the beginning, we have different kinds of models. One is the likelihood that a given an animal will prefer a different given kind of structure. Another is if you have a certain structure, what animals are going to want to use it. And then finally, frequency of use. This shows the logic model, an example of it at the bottom. But thinking about all the variables, you would just keep adding those variables to that model. Okay, so our findings were thankfully and surprisingly consistent with the literature. So we didn't have to explain why they were different. But they expanded the literature, which, as most literature does, generally focuses on the certain species or groups that are in the vicinity of the study. So ours added to it basically by having different species and more species than the papers listed. It also allows us to extend the recommendation literature, which what I mean by that are the different kinds of technical reports that say this is what a structure should look like if you have wildlife that are moving around and you want to accommodate them. These are not based on statistical models, and so they are science-free, but that doesn't mean they're not wrong necessarily, so they could be tested. And then finally, we can use these models for evaluating existing culverts and bridges. And this to me is probably the most exciting part, because if you think about a state like California, we have approximately 5,000 state highway bridges across waterways and another 10,000 odd local bridges across waterways. We have an unknown number of culverts because of data sharing issues, but let's say 100,000. So we've got way more crossing possibilities than we're ever going to build. So evaluating how those are functioning in wildlife permeability would be a great thing to do. Okay, I'm going to talk about the structure-focused models, and I'm going to show a couple of things. One is that if a word is green, that means there's a positive association with that variable and wildlife tolerance or use of the structure. So in this case, California ground squirrel, they have a positive relationship between structure width and the likelihood of use. They have a negative relationship with openness ratio, and that's not because openness ratio is necessarily bad, it's just that openness ratio also includes height and length. Height and length actually were not significant in terms of explanatory variables, and you can see those two curves on the far right. Okay, so they like wider structures, but they don't want them to be really big. So think of like probably a flat tunnel like that would be good for that. For deer, there were significant positive associations between structure width and height. So they like them wide, they like them tall, but openness ratio and length were not significant. Openness ratio is often used to plan for wildlife crossings for ungulates, so I think it's worth thinking about that. And there's a very big N for this, so I would say this is a pretty strong result. Bobcat, structure height had a negative influence on bobcat use, whereas length and width have a positive influences. And this is, you'll see a bit in contrast with mountain lions or puma. And it could be that bobcat are avoiding bigger animals that have the opposite preference and are using those other kinds of structures. And so they're choosing to use or tolerating structures that are different from what their larger carnivore cousins might use. So mountain lions, they like taller structures. They don't like them too long. They like them to be wide. It's kind of the opposite of bobcats. And for all of these, you can see the shape of the curves. And I want to point out that these aren't continuously linear into forever. If you look at the height there, it maxes out. And so at some height, it just doesn't matter for mountain lions how much taller it's going to be. And then for length, it also bottoms out. And at that point, it doesn't matter. If it's longer, they're just not going to use it. They seem to continuously prefer wider structures. So we combine these into overall predictive models that allow us to then say for any given structure or for the animals that we looked at, and then also for animal frequency, we can give a prediction of use. This doesn't mean it is absolutely accurate. I'd say it's relatively accurate. So here's an example and in a spreadsheet format. This is for bobcat. The top three lines are structural attributes. And so in this case, a 10-meter tall, 10-meter wide structure that's 30 meters long. And then the red boxed variables are landscape variables. So given those distances, if that's what your structure looked like, you have a 72% chance of bobcats showing up in places they occur. This obviously isn't true for places that bobcats don't occur. We can change those. So if you go back and forth, you look at just the landscape variables, you don't have to pay attention to any particular one, but I basically change those. Changing those results in a change in likelihood of use, and it could be distance from preferred habitat or proximity to development activity. Structure variables also have an effect. So if you look at this, we have a 10-meter tall, 10-meter wide structure that's 30 meters long. If we instead make it 75 meters long and slightly different landscape variables, sorry about that, we can change the likelihood of use. This actually also shows the likelihood of use across different seasons. And unfortunately, in this example, there's no difference across those seasons. I should have paid more attention to that. Okay, so what can we use this for? And as I talked about earlier, we can use it both to evaluate existing structures. And so the structures are those simple diagrams across the top. The SP1, SP2, SP3, et cetera, are different species. And the arrows are just theoretically pointing to which species are likely to use those structures. So we can take those structure attributes and locations across an entire state, let's say, and predict wildlife use for at least for those species for all of those structures. So for example, all the culverts and bridges in a state. We can also use it to plan new structures and say, given the species that you're interested in, what kind of structures do they prefer? And you're actually doing it in response to biological information as opposed to random mass guesses. Okay, existing structures. Here's some maps just to show you the known locations of culverts and bridges in open data sets. The top fuzzy map on the right is for California, where data sets are less known. And so you could take all of these and estimate permeability at the state scale. Today, tomorrow, you can do it now for those particular species. We've included the coefficients, the model I showed you basically in spreadsheet form in a web tool where you can drop a pin and basically create a structure and then figure out which of those species are likely to use that structure because you have its location in the landscape, you give it attributes, and you can get that estimate. This could be an existing structure, as I talked about earlier. It could also be a planned structure, and you could then change the variables to optimize your likelihood of species using the structure. I want to thank my two funders here, Wildlife Conservation Network and Pacific Southwest Region UTC, which like all UTCs had its funding completely cut 12 days ago. And actually wanted to say that this tool, if you're interested in this, this will be part of a presentation on Thursday. Look for the term cross-plan. I don't remember which session it's in, but it's one of our other what we call the Senate talks. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions.
Questions? Can you, Fraser, explain again the difference in the two uses of animal? One was, does the animal choose to use the structure? But the other one is, does the animal use the structure?
Yeah. So it took me months to understand that.
Okay,
right?
good. So yeah, that's really great.
Okay, repeating the question, which I think if you use that mic, it's okay. But explain the difference between the structure use model and the animal use model. I think is the so from one of those points of view, you're the animal, you're walking along, and you've got a menu of structures. Which one do you like? Is it the small, little, round, long one? Is it the big, wide, short one? Does it depend if there's forest nearby, et cetera? So that's an animal preference. Which one are they going to pick? Which do they prefer? The flip side of it is, if you're one of those structures, who's going to come to the party? Right? So if you build a certain type of structure, what kinds of animals are going to use it? So it's a structure-centric view of the world. And that the easy way to think of that is the existing culverts and bridges are already there. They're a certain size, they're in a certain place. So you're basically finding out what species will tolerate using those to get from one side of the road to the other. They're highly related concepts. It's just one's from the point of view of the animal, the other's from the point of view of the structure. Did that make sense? Because I barely get it myself.
I mean, it does make sense, but they are
Highly related. Yeah.
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 Any questions? Oh,
So Fraser, I know you already know this, but on I-90, DOT created an experiment because we have an overcrossing and then 220-foot wide undercrossings that are tall. And anyway, you should, and they're collecting lots of data. And we
Yeah.
do have 2 cameras, video cameras on
Yeah.
each of those, so it gives you all that information. Anyway, you should take a look at that. One of the fascinating things we need is the coyotes. We know coyotes will use a 120-foot bridge, but they prefer that overcrossing. I think it was more than 1,000 crossings, might have been closer to 2,000, and they were not using the undercrossing.
Yeah.
So
Well, that might be because mountain lions will only use the undercrossing and don't want the overcrossing.
it could be, it
A
also
lesson for
could,
overcrossing builders, but
it also could be a few individuals that just keep going back and forth.
It could be that,
And they're
yeah.
just eating Chris's small mammals.
yeah, it's a smorgasbord out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, it's a great idea. And actually since I work with WashDOT on those structures, right, is to collect up some structures that we didn't use in creating models and then test our predictions, which are likely to be wrong, like all model predictions, but maybe they'll be relatively close, like in terms of rank.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Oh, yeah.
So you have California ground squirrels, which we have just documented on one of our overcrossings, but they're an invasive species. So do you think you can use this to predict ways to prevent, to, encourage native species and discourage invasive species?
I wouldn't say they're invasive so much as climate migrants.
well.
You know? Maybe they're invasive, but
And across the river.
because they're very tolerant of stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, and actually to forgive California ground squirrels a little bit, there's evidence in at least one location in California where they're genetically distinguishable and they're going in separate directions because of a highway and a rail line in a road in between, so Coyote Valley. And so, and that's because they won't use the structures that are available there in that location. But yeah, you could use them to filter out. You could conceivably use structures to filter out. And for some people in the Bay Area who don't want elk to migrate around to their ancestral habitat in the Bay Area, they're thinking that new wildlife crossings should be structured in a way that elk won't want to use them, which is challenging because in this case it's Thule elk and they will actually use box culverts, unlike other elk. So I'm not sure how they're going to do that, but maybe a low fence, I don't know. Similar to how do you keep humans out of crossing structures. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.